there's going to be a certain kind of reckoning with that, where people are going to say, like, can you believe these people took a finite natural resource, turned it into a single-use beverage container, sometimes for water that they could have gotten out of a water fountain, and then drank that one drink and then threw it in the trash. I mean, if you phrase it this way, it just sounds absurd, and yet that is exactly what we're doing.
The creek I'm standing in right now is called Dry Curtis Creek. It's out of the way of a lot of the city center of Logan, Utah, and Hiram, Utah, and Cache Valley. And I find plastics in my samples up here, which is really crazy. There's not a lot of human activity up here. Nobody is really trekking in plastics. There isn't a lot of waste floating around in the breeze out here. It's a pretty remote area, and that's really concerning to see. There are currently about 8 billion tons of plastics on this earth. And to put that into perspective, that's about 8 billion elephants. I think most people have seen how big elephants are. That is a lot of plastic pollution. I got contacted by a friend who let me know that there was a really cool project out at Utah State with Dr. Janice Brahney on cyanotoxins in the Great Salt Lake. And as I was getting into studying that and beginning that project, I came across microplastics. Janice Brahney had a wonderful paper published in Science on microplastics in the atmosphere and in the environment in remote areas of the American West. And I thought, wow, I can't believe that is really a thing that is real.
It's not like I set out to initially ask and answer the question, how is plastic moving through the atmosphere? It was an accidental discovery. I thought for a long time this was a marine issue, that plastics were accumulating in the marine environment. I didn't think about it a lot. So I can only speak to my ignorance, but it's because I didn't know. And I think that's probably true for a lot of accidental microplastic researchers. And there are a lot of those out there that didn't expect to find microplastics in their environment and then did, and then started to research it. Because I was really interested in what dust is made out of, I started looking at it under the microscope, and that's when I discovered that there's brightly colored pieces of plastic all throughout my samples. I realized this was a really big deal because plastic is moving through our atmosphere. Under a clear, beautiful day like today, there's a lot of plastic falling out of the sky. And that plastic is pretty small in size and coming from really far away. This is in fact happening, that plastics are cycling through the Earth's system. We ended up quantifying that anywhere between 1,000 and 4,000 tons of plastic is deposited into protected areas in the Western United States, which is an enormous amount of plastic. And if we take those values from our remote locations and extrapolate over the entire US, it's about 22,000 tons. But that's of course likely an underestimate, because the closer you are to highways and urban centers, we would anticipate seeing greater plastic deposition rates. I think I was surprised at every turn in this research. I didn't anticipate seeing plastic in my samples. I didn't anticipate seeing so much plastic in my samples. I really wanted to draw attention to the pervasiveness of plastic in the atmosphere, and that there's really no escaping it, that this is a global human problem, and to do anything about it, we need to mobilize at many different levels of organization. It's really going to take a global collaborative effort. And so I was really trying to draw attention to the fact that you can't go to the Grand Canyon and not experience atmospheric microplastics. It's there too.
In the 1980s, about 2 million metric tons of plastics were produced per year. And today, or as of 2018, 2019, about 381 million metric tons of plastic were being produced. About 12 to 18% of that plastic produced per year ends up in the environment, whether it be through macroplastic pollution or microplastic pollution. Microplastics are any plastics that are 5 millimeters or less in size, so 5 millimeters to 1 micron, 5 millimeters being the top of a pushpin, and about 7 to 8 microns is a red blood cell, so just a little bit smaller than that, it can be considered a microplastic.
The term plastic is often misused nowadays. So originally what it means that plastic means is it's easy to be deformed. So it changes shape very easily. They are low cost and made of synthetic polymers. So now what is polymer, right? So this term comes from Greek, right? So it has two parts in it. So poly and mer, right? Poly just means many, 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 many. And mer means unit. So basically, these are really, really big molecules, but they have repeated structures. So repeated itself into a very, very long chain. And that's the material, we call it polymers. In terms of the types of polymers up there, so all these bags, all these wrappers, they are polyethylene, okay? And another key one that's also very important is called PET, polyethylene terephthalate, and that's soda bottles. Right, so these two main, obviously there are many other uses for these two type of polymers, but simplified it, you have these food packaging that's polyethylene, and all these beverage packaging that's PET. In general, in our daily life, plastics means that these are just cheap materials that we don't care about it after, and that has something to do with the problem we're facing nowadays.
17 of every 20 pounds of plastics went off to the wars. What can be made with plastics? Things as varied as buttons and batons, cosmetic containers and cockpit housings, parachutes and refrigerators, radios and razors, all contain plastics. To the chemist, he's a molecular engineer. He takes organic substances, those containing carbon, such as petroleum, or another source material of plastics, coal. He takes one molecule made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, puts it together with another molecule containing the same elements, but in different arrangement, and the reaction results in a new molecule, which looks like this. The addition of asbestos may make it heat resistant, just the thing for such purposes as insulating, electric iron handles, fire helmets, and trays.
Pretty much all plastics derives from petrochemicals, so derived from petroleum, crude oil for the most part. The whole plastic industry builds upon this amazing infrastructure of our petroleum supply chain.
One of the things that had really changed, especially in the United States when it comes to American plastics manufacturing, was the oil booms. You had California, Oklahoma, all these big oil booms in the early part of the 20th century. You had this automobile industry that was exploding, think of the Ford Model T coming out in 1908, but of course, like the widespread adoption of these cars in the teens and 20s. And so we have this like fossil fueled economy that's exploding, in an automobile industry that's guzzling this gasoline. And that byproduct of all that refining, as I said, is just the stockpile of material that's super cheap. They basically say that they felt like they were just, this material was just being given away to them. I mean, imagine your whole industry being based on a material that was so cheap that you'd say something like that.
The old adage has it that necessity is the mother of invention. Nowhere is this truer than in the field of plastics.
What's really made plastic booming is World War II. Because of the shortage of resources in all these materials, people trying to make replacement to packaging, to construction materials, and then really scaled up the implementation of these polymer chemistry, how we make either very stiff and strong parts from those petrochemicals, or very rubbery and elastic materials like tire, right, from the same petrochemicals.
By the 40s and 50s, we're talking about just so much plastic. I mean, just in our clothes and artificial Christmas trees. I mean, you name it, everything is covered in plastic. I argue like it's a better way to think about it is we're just covered in oil. We're just covered in the waste products of oil. I mean, the chemical firms were all out in front on this, and that would also include the oil industries as well. They became really involved as well. But you have Dow, DuPont, Monsanto, and they all have this incentive to unleash this and to find big markets for it and to court companies like Coca-Cola. Imagine if you get the Coke contract, my gosh, they sell 1.9 billion servings of their product every day. I mean, it's just the vastness of your market is hard to fathom from a chemical company's angle. So it's just a full and mighty kind of and diversified industrial portfolio of people, including the oil companies, which get into producing their own plastics and chemicals themselves. I think there was just powerful interest that we're seeing this as a very profitable future.
We're now more of a consumer culture that doesn't value and think of ourselves and gets a meaning from what we accomplish, from what we do, from what contributions we make, but from how much we own or possess or how economically successful we're doing compared to the next guy. Almost to be a good American was to be a good consumer, and to be a good consumer was to buy lots of products. That's the very definition of consumer type culture.
You grab, food, fruit, or meat, anything on the shelf, and they're wrapped in plastic, right? You go to the flower section, and all these bundles are wrapped in plastic, and you go to the hospital, and all these medical supplies, medical consumables are plastic, right? You go drive your car, and you're sitting with all these plastic materials.
Look at me, I'm just surrounded. I mean, and I'm trying hard. I mean, you name it. It's everything else we've made. The economy is this, what I call a scavenger capitalism economy. It's all made from the waste of the oil industry.
Plastic is so convenient, it's light, it can last forever if you want it to last, or you could just dispose of it when you want to get rid of it. For some people, they just don't know any difference, so it's just been normalized and they don't think about it because they assume that this is the way it always was. Plastics have always existed. My products come out, I tear off the plastic, they look crisp, they look clean, they look sanitized, that is there, and then I just throw away the plastic. And I have no idea the accumulated tons of garbage that ends up in dumps that just sits for centuries and centuries and centuries.
Waste products, 4 to 8 pounds per day from each of us.
We stopped putting a price on the package itself. We stopped putting value on the packaging and expected people just to return this material even though there was no incentive to do so. If we look to history, we can see that we had a returnable glass bottle system that for half a century worked incredibly well. The record that I saw in the archives was of bottles, glass bottles, that did trips 40, 50, 60, sometimes 70, I mean, even higher times back and forth between the bottler and consumer. It was reused over and over. And, you know, the overarching question was, how the heck did that work? And the answer is they put a deposit on the bottle. They actually put a price on that bottle. It could be, you know, sometimes 1 to 2 cents. I mean, think about that. It's a 5-cent drink. That's like that's a large portion of that purchase. You're going to want to get that money back. And if you don't put a price on pollution, guess what? We're subsidizing right now profligacy. We're telling soft drink companies, no, we'll pay for the curbside recycling and the municipal waste dumping, and we'll, as citizens, pay for all that. We're giving no pressure to industry in the United States to actually innovate and do something new.
The systems have been dismantled and taken away because it's cheaper for the producer to produce their Coca-Cola or their Pepsi bottle in a single-use plastic bottle. They don't need to have responsibility for collecting, for cleaning, for washing, you know? So this is what I explained. It takes away the responsibility of doing that, and it now puts it on the municipalities, it puts it on the consumer, and then it reduces their costs. I am a campaigns advisor for the Changing Markets Foundation. What we do is that we were formed to accelerate and scale up solutions to sustainability challenges. And we do that by leveraging the power of markets. And usually how we work is in partnership with other NGOs and foundations and other research organizations to kind of create and support campaigns that shift the market share away from unsustainable companies and products and towards more environmentally and socially beneficial solutions. What the Talking Trash report kind of does is that looks at the global approach by big plastic to ensure that that big, large corporations that are mostly responsible for the plastic crisis, how they evade their true accountability for their pollution. We published this in 2020 now. Wow, time flies. So we looked and analyzed the voluntary commitments from the 10 biggest plastic polluters. And among those companies are Coca-Cola, Colgate-Palmolive, Danone, Mars Incorporated, Mondelez International, Nestle, PepsiCo, Perfetti Van Mel, Procter & Gamble, and Unilever, who have a joint plastic footprint of almost 10 million tons of plastic per year, which is the equivalent of kind of 30 times the weight of the Empire State Building. And that is absolutely crazy. What we realized when we started this investigation was that a lot of focus had been put on end-of-pipe solutions. A lot of money was going into ocean and beach cleanups. And there was also a lot of emphasis on blaming consumers for their individual plastic use. And we kind of realized that there was a pattern that we called delay, derail, and distract, or distract, delay, derail, or the industry playbook, right? And we saw this being repeated across different periods of time and across different geographical locations. We looked into the commitments of Coca-Cola, and which is the biggest plastic polluter in the world, with a plastic footprint of 2.9 million tons per year. And we look at across 30 years how they have continuously broken, delayed, and kind of shifted the goalpost on the very most impressive sounding targets, right? So they make these targets, they put in place that they will reach these targets, whether it is on recyclability or reusability, and then when they don't get to them, they break them, they delay, or they shift kind of the goalpost, which is what has happened, kind of shifting the blame that, you know, it's the consumer who is the one that doesn't know how to recycle. It's the consumer that doesn't know how to dispose their garbage. Is the consumer the one that is not a good consumer, you know, when in fact we are being provided with items that cannot be recycled, because whether there is no industry for that, whether there is no use for that material, whether it's cheaper to just use single-use plastic again, right, instead of recycled plastic. So there are all these nuances that take place, and then when you look into them, you realize that in fact the consumer is being put as responsible, and it's being thought as responsible, when in fact there is a problem from the beginning of the production or the design of the product. Then we see like set up independent organizations. These environmental organizations kind of promote, or we've discovered that they promote the agenda of, you know, different companies. So since 1950s, we realized that Big Plastic had deliberately focused on blaming consumers. So for example, Keep America Beautiful, which is like one of the oldest one, kind of created by Coca-Cola and funded by them. But there is a very famous advert that said, people start pollution.
People can stop it.
This is a perfect example of blaming consumers. And this is how far back it goes, right? And this is when you realize how intrinsic and how deep rooted this issue is.
We do see this massive waste coming out of this kind of throwaway culture in the 60s and 70s. There's a kind of visible spectacle of it, to the degree that states and environmentalists begin saying, this is unconscionable, we need to do something about this. So decades ago, there was an attempt to intervene. But at that time, curbside recycling was held out by industry as a kind of solution to the problem. And the idea was that to fight these plans, for example, to ban non-returnable, non-deposit containers, which, by the way, was proposed by Congress in 1970. Imagine our world if that had happened. But it gets defeated in a time where industry is arguing, no, we don't need to do that. Curbside recycling is emerging, this new technology that's going to clean up all this waste. And it was a really, I think, alluring promise of, we don't need to put a price on packaging, we don't need deposits, we don't need returnables, we'll just recycle it all. And we'll invest in these huge curbside recycling systems, and it'll do it. This is what's useful about histories. We can now look back 50 years and say, did that gamble pay off? And the answer is emphatically no. Curbside recycling, as useful as it was no replacement or solution to that problem. It didn't deal with the throwaway culture issues. It in some ways, I think, exacerbated it by not forcing industry to confront the pollution problems they were creating 50 years ago. And in some ways subsidized their continued use of materials that I think are the problematic materials that we know of today, PET plastic bottles and others. Once you say that the package has no value, like do with it as you please, we see what happens. And the problem is a lot of the solutions right now are, let's just educate the public more. Let's put out more recycling bins. You see this all the time from industry, and that's because they don't want to fundamentally change the game. It's easier to continue to be basically subsidized by the public, which pays for all this waste, both environmentally in terms of the cost, but also in terms of the physical, like removing of the waste to landfills or wherever it goes. It's easier just to do that. It's more cost efficient for the business just to outsource those costs. And that's why you'll constantly see them say, like, we're in this promotion of educating the consumer, or of building out more recycling bins at the site. We don't need more recycling bins. You know, we've got plenty. There's 5 on this hallway right here, and yet that's not solving our 30% threshold for this stuff. We have a 30% recycling rate for PET plastic bottles in this country. It's stalled. It's been at 30% or around there for the last decade and a half. And 70% of those things are ending up in landfills, in our waterways, in our streams, or in our national parks.
I think every one of us, when we put these quote-unquote recyclable items in our recycling bin, we would imagine on the other side someone or a robot would clean it perfectly and ship it back to the grocery stores to reload these goods. But that rarely happens. I think that is the main reason for something like PET, that all kinds of recycling technology are ready, but we're only seeing about 30% recycling rate in the United States. And for all the other types of plastic, it's less than 10%. What happens is so-called material recovery facility, MRF, or MRF, as a lot of people say. Every city has a MRF or multiple MRFs. It is a place to take those curbside recyclables, right, and dump on a conveying belt and just manually pick out what's valuable in there. As you would imagine, that's definitely not the perfect place, well, the most ideal place to work, and it is not efficient. It's very labor intensive, and because of this, what can happen is if you have a little bit contaminant in one bin of those recyclables, they would have no choice but to reject the whole thing.
So this is recyclable. These machines are so sensitive that this cardboard went all the way through because it was reading the aluminum can in there.
Wow.
So actually the optical sorters, they're capturing, they're trying to separate it because it's reading the aluminum.
I think for every one of us, we should at least spend some time in MRF just to see it or visit it to know what's really going on.
Because usually down there, all those trees and stuff have plastic bags.
Yeah.
Right there, you can see them. That's our Christmas decoration.
Not only we're not recycling single-use plastic very well, we're also not recycling durable plastic materials as well. So take example, carpet, right? So when you rip off the carpet and replace the new one, where you put that carpet into? In the trash bin. You know, Home Depot, Lowe's don't want it back, right? Well, actually in those carpet, it's the same PET polymer. You know, the PET used in water bottles is the same polymer used in carpet, right? But we don't recycle it at all. Take another example. You know, I'm a snowboarder, so I have quite a few boards, and I don't ride them anymore. But where I put it? You know, very intuitively, people know there's value to it. You don't even want to throw it away, but you kind of have to. Right now, either plastic or even durable materials, we are seeing a linear economy, right? We dig these resources from under the ground and then refine it, and all these chemical reactions to make these raw materials, and then they are made into the useful products and distributed to customers, and customers throw it away. That's a linear economy. I think the barrier, just like many other things, is business decision. Right now, very few peculiar cases, recycling of plastic is profitable, but many are not. So if you look at it from a business standpoint, is if these, say polyethylene again, they're so cheap to make the original material, so why bother remake it again?
But we created a very human-centric culture, not just capitalist culture, but we could go further back, Judeo-Christian culture. God created the earth with people at the center, and everything else that was created was to serve their needs. And capitalism bought into some of that.
Microplastics are everywhere in the environment, so we're seeing them anywhere from urban environments to remote areas like the Grand Canyon. And what that means for our health and the health of other organisms is essentially unknown at this point, but there is a lot of room for research here, and hopefully in the coming years we find answers to these questions. But right now we're just kind of in the dark about some of it.
What's really unnerving to me personally is how pervasive plastic is, and how in many environments we're really only discovering how pervasive it is. So I feel like we're a little late to the game in terms of understanding how much plastic is in the atmosphere, in our human bodies, for example. Every day there's new research coming out. But at this point, we just don't have a lot of data. We don't have a lot of data points, not a lot of studies to say conclusively that this is what's happening and why. Microplastic is a big group of compounds. So there could be a lot of nuance of us consuming microplastics as well as plastics being in the environment. And so at this point, it's really difficult to say what the implications are, but the more research that comes out, the more nervous I get, to be honest.
Major curveball. How do we fix this issue? What's the solution? Just out of the blue.
I don't know, actually. I don't think there is any easy solution, and to be honest, I don't really know what are these entailed solutions that can come together to solve this.
To live in a very highly capitalistic society is to live in one where you value efficiency, where you value being able to buy things at the lowest cost possible without having to think about it. That as a consumer, you're free to choose with as little social responsibility or obligation as possible. The choice is what type of products you want to buy and how much you can buy and how much you're entitled to. That's part of the equation of what people grow up into and are socialized to believe.
That mentality, it just became normal in a way that, again, I think 50 years from now, people can look back and say, wow, those single-use containers or the single-use whatever it might be can you believe that was like a system that they believed in, and a planet that clearly has finite limits and limitations? Think about how scary it is to me when I leave my house every morning and I've got a 4.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old that I'm looking at. I mean, just pause with that for a second. Imagine yourself 20 years from now, you know, looking into the eyes of a little baby. And if you sit with it and you actually think about what that kid's future is going to be,